For me. So Grace actually was my postdoc advisor, so it's really lovely to be here today as her colleague. She is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University. She studies typical and atypical development to selective attention and its relationship to social competence, mental health, and family and societal well-being. She is recognized as one of BC's key researchers on autism spectrum disorder. Throughout her professional and academic career, she has worked closely with government agencies and community partners to educate and advocate for the needs of persons with ASD and their families, especially those from underserved immigrant and Indigenous communities. Her contributions were recognized with the 2018 Professional of the Year Award from Autism BC and a 2021 Distinguished Women Scholars Award and lecture from the University of Victoria. Professor Iarocci is also a practicing psychologist in BC, providing diagnosis, assessment, and access to support for autistic individuals and their families. So without further ado, hand it over to Grace.
Thank you, Alina, for that very nice introduction, and thank you, Kelly and Randy, for organizing this. It's been great. Sorry I missed yesterday. I'm sure it's lovely. So today, excuse me. So today I'll be talking a little bit from a developmental perspective on resilience. From a developmental perspective, resilience is defined a little differently than what I heard on Monday, but we'll go through that. I think overall, I'll start by just briefly defining autism for those of you who don't know too much about the condition, and resilience from a developmental perspective. Then I've chosen 3 studies, sort of briefly show you the kinds of things that we are doing to support families and individuals, autistic individuals. So there's an early years focus on parents, and then we look at students, peers in school, and the transition to adulthood, focus on social inclusion. And if I have time, I'll tell you a little bit about how we're trying to include autistic people in the autism research. So autism is kind of a misnomer. It's really not one thing. We suspect that there are many different forms of autism. We just don't know what underlies it. So we talk about it as a developmental disability or disabilities. It's a set of behaviorally defined differences. So we define it based on behavior. There are no medical tests that we know of that can detect autism. So we'll talk primarily about social communication style, how it's different, both verbal and nonverbal features. For example, speech, difference in prosody, differences in eye contact, differences in use of gesture, facial expressiveness, and things like that. And then there's also a cluster of behaviors that involve repetitive, so either movements or repetitive thoughts, and really focused and intense interest. There's also an area that looks at sensory processing differences. I don't think we know enough about this area, but we certainly see quite a few, probably I would say 80 to 90% of autistic people having some form of sensory processing difference. Autism is an invisible disability. It occurs in all races, cultures, countries, socioeconomic status, and it's very heterogeneous. So in terms of how do we define resilience from a developmental perspective, early notions of resilience were that a child could just bounce back from adversity, sort of like the image of, a rubber duck who you could squeeze it, but it would come right back to its original form. We also originally thought that resilience was all about the individual, their internal characteristics, how intelligent they were, how motivated they were, how perseverant they were. But now we understand resilience from a developmental perspective more like this. It depends on factors, a variety of factors, including family support, peer relationships and peer support, and community services and support. So it really depends on a whole variety of things. And we don't think of resilience as a global trait. Like, it's not a resilient child. It's really looking at different areas of development and understanding where is resilience in this child, what aspects are resilient and what aspects are still vulnerable. So just to give you an example, you could have a child who is vulnerable or has been through some very difficult trauma and is doing well academically, but they're highly anxious. So that child is resilient in certain respects, but also still quite vulnerable. So I like to use Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological model to understand child development. So initially, when I started in this field, like most clinical psychologists, we think that we're going to change the world, we're going to, fix and cure, psychological disorders. And I was really focused on understanding autism as it happens in the individual, what's happening with this child. How is their sensory system different? How is their attention system different? So I was really focused on the child. As I progressed and evolved in this field, I realized that I'm not less interested in the child and what's going on internally for that child, but I recognize that what is more effective in terms of supporting and helping the child develop optimally is to think about their other systems around that support the child. So things like parents, families, the quality of life for these parents and families, peers, peer interaction and peer acceptance, society and culture, like addressing stigma for these folks, and the development of the field itself, the neurodiversity movement and what it's done to really bring attention to autistic individuals and their plight. So one of the things we've done is begin to focus on parents. We have, we originally thought, okay, parents have quite a burden in terms of not only having to parent children, but also parent children that they didn't expect, children that are different, that need specialized services. So we noticed in the literature that, parents of neurodivergent children are highly invested, but they lack efficacy. So they have this high investment, but they don't feel very rewarded in their parenting, and they don't feel very confident in their parenting. And often there's also a lot of guilt for these parents. The other thing about parents that parent autistic children is that there's familial risk. This means that it's a highly genetic condition, and family members, not just other siblings, but even parents, may be affected in some way. So we might have parents who are autistic themselves, or who have ADHD, or who have learning disabilities, mental health struggles, etc. We know from the literature that parent depression is much higher in these folks than it is in any other developmental disability group. And one other thing about these families is that they rely on government services or professional services In fact, those are essential to supporting these parents' efforts. During the pandemic, we saw how devastating it was when all of those services were closed. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we recognized that these families were in distress. We did a very quick survey. We got together with a nonprofit organization that we've known for a long time, Autism Community Training. And we were able to survey 238 caregivers with children with autism in BC between the ages of 2 and 18. So we had a vast, parents of young children, parents of adolescents and young adults. And what we found, this is just a little tidbit from the study, to show you how distressed the families were. We asked them, did you ever during this period consider putting your child into care at the Ministry of Children and Family Development due to lack of services and supports? And we had 9% of our sample said yes. And here's just a qualitative quote from one of the parents who said, I've been close to relinquishing guardianship to just keep what's left of my family together. So really, really distressing. We knew we had to do something for these families. So we used a community engaged research approach where we had the executive director of ACT, my student, Vanessa Fong, the principal of POPARD, which is a provincial organization that provides consultation to all schools across BC on autism. Dr. Georgina Robinson is also a psychologist. And we got together and said, what can we do during this time where parents have access to almost no services and the schools are closed? So we identified some priorities around research for parents in particular. And we recruited through ACT, the nonprofit organization. They generously offered to provide this free online program to parents. And we selected a number of parents, obviously we couldn't service everybody, to do this pilot study. So Dr. Georgina Robinson was trained in this compassion in parenting approach. And so we decided, let's do a pilot study and see how this works, because it's an opportunity during the pandemic to do online interventions. And this particular approach had not been used on an online format before. So it was a 10-week intervention for caregivers of autistic children to help build problem solving, emotion regulation, mindfulness, self-compassion, and stress reduction. This approach, this compassion and parenting approach, it's a combined sort of practice approach. It takes mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindful self-compassion, and mindful parenting, and kind of puts it together. Now, it had been studied before in other populations, but it had never been delivered online. So it was a bit of a gamble, but we said, let's try. So we had 80 caregivers. We did multiple groups. 98% were mothers. This is not a surprise. We see this all the time in this population. Mothers are primarily responsible. They range from age from 26 to 59. They all had an autistic child, at least one. Some of them had multiple children. And the mean age of the children was 12 years. The income range you can see is lower than we see in most studies. And this was, it was a free program. And so it attracted families who were of lower SES. And they were all residents of British Columbia. So we looked at a few measures. We did a pre and post intervention survey to ask the parents how they felt about the program itself, the delivery online, etc. We also looked at family quality of life. We looked at caregiver mindfulness, caregiver emotion regulation, how they regulate their own emotions, their parenting sense of competence, and their caregiver self-compassion and caregiver mental health. And although this is just a pilot study, we really, have to do much more to decide whether this is an approach that's effective and able to be administered widely online. We did get some pretty promising results. So we had on a variety of those measures looked at effect sizes. So we had medium to large effect sizes on pretty much all of those indicators. So if you look here, so we had changes in the caregiver's sense of mindfulness, their emotion regulation, their own sense of competency as a parent, and many of them really did enjoy the program. So it's very promising. We're going to continue and see how we can develop this program. It's very cost effective. It probably wouldn't be free in the future unless it was funded, but we could definitely do it at a reduced cost. So here are some of the qualitative sort of interview quotes that we have from the caregivers. I believe now that it is okay for me to take 10 minutes for myself and that I can actually go to an event to either improve myself or make me feel better about myself. This has been a mind shift for me. Then another parent says, learning self-care for myself is important. Learning to care for my feelings and emotions and getting rid of guilt. I've learned to forgive myself for mistakes and not beat myself up. Another parent says, the feeling of community and support alone meant the world to me. The practices helped me connect with myself and my child as well as the learning to them. And then parents also talked about the benefits for their child. So this one parent said, I like to think that I've been slower to react to frustrating situations so I can take my son's point of view into consideration before reacting. I've been seeing more of the small moments of joy that he brings and appreciating them more. Another parent says, I'm doing some of the practices with my daughter. I have improved my relationship with my daughter without autism. I often get frustrated with her and give her more demands. I'm more aware of how I treat her and I'm stopping and noticing more now. So it seems like the program is helping parents sort of reflect more on themselves and their own behavior, and it's having an impact on their relationship with their children. And in terms of benefits for the family, one parent said, I've already incorporated some things as part of my family routine, such as the nature walks and starfish reading exercise. Another parent said, it has caused things to be calmer and more thoughtful. We are making changes as a family for the good. So overall, I think pretty promising, although there's a caveat that this was just a pilot study. There is a lot more research that needs to be done. So moving into the school years, in early childhood, really the focus, I think, in terms of supports is the parents and the family. During the school years, it shifts to peers and the sort of school context. So one of the things that we know from the literature is that there's a lot of stigma around autism still today, and that autistic individuals' social abilities may not be the only factor that's influencing their social success. Right? We tend to think about, well, they have the disability, right? They have social challenges, but in interactions, it's reciprocal, right? The other individual who's interacting with that autistic person can make that more successful or less successful. So non-autistic individuals' social perception and their behavior also contribute to autistic individuals' social development. And there's extensive evidence that non-autistic people rate first impressions, very brief first impressions of autistic adults very negatively, not knowing that they're autistic. course, but they're shown very quick videos, brief videos, and asked to rate these folks. And study after study shows that they rate them much more negatively. So non-autistic individuals' perception of autistic individuals is influenced by autism knowledge. So we know that those people who have contact, good quality contact, more frequent contact, and who have knowledge about autism actually rate them better. And so there is something to be said about understanding and contact with autistic people in terms of decreasing that bias. So we asked, are these negative perceptions malleable? Can we do something about it? So my students and I embarked on this study. It was really quite an endeavor. We had a bunch of senior high school students from the local high school come up to SFU, and we did an educational presentation about autism. And we had people from my lab. Some of them have family members who are autistic, and myself. So we all sort of presented a little bit about autism, and we had video, PowerPoint slides and so on. So we had in all 151 senior high school, grade 11, grade 12 students who completed the first impression scale. So it's just asking questions about, what do you think of this person on the video? And they had video recordings, very brief, of 20 autistic adults and 20 non-autistic adults, and they didn't know who was who. In sort of a social situation, like talking to somebody. And they did the first impression scale either before the educational presentation or after. The presentation took about 50 minutes, and then we had 10 minutes to ask questions or make comments. And then we also assessed the students' prior experiences with autistic people, the quantity and quality of their contact with autistic people. And we used the multidimensional social competence scale, that's a scale we developed in the lab, to look at how they rated their own social competence. And what we found was interesting. We obviously, not groundbreaking changes in first impressions, but we did get modest improvements in student ratings for those who had first seen the video and then did the first impressions scale. So they endorsed more positive ratings of even attractiveness, likability, like would you sit next to this person on a bus, those sorts of questions. And they reported greater social interest in the autistic adults, like would you invite this person over, would you sit, would you go out with them, those sorts of things. One interesting unexpected finding was that the self-reports of greater social competence among the students, so those who felt that they had better social competence, their self-rating, was associated with greater bias against autistic adults. So what we are hypothesizing is that those who value typical or normative social skills, they actually be more judgmental to those who socialize in a different way, who are somewhat different in their social competencies. So we have to investigate this further. I think that's pretty interesting finding. Okay, and now the transition to adulthood. So when autistic students leave their really highly supported, in many cases, high school setting, and they move into post-secondary, like SFU, we noticed that these students often are in a kind of a shock situation because suddenly they don't have all the supports or people that really follow them along and see, what they're needing or what the resources would be best for them. They're kind of on their own, advocating, coming to advocate for themselves. And the post-secondary situation, they're large, right? They're huge places, and it's hard for them to feel connected and find social opportunities. So we also know from the literature that autistic students are more likely to drop out, and not because they're not capable in terms of academics, but mostly because of the lack of being connected, mental health problems, difficulty finding the right support. There's also that feeling that the study, the same Canadian colleagues found that the reasons that some of the autistic students said that they were likely to drop out were because they really felt like a kind of culture shock in the post-secondary situation. They have never really been in that kind of situation where there was a lot of autonomy and nobody really looking after them. And they were also disengaged in terms of their studies and not having really a lot of support. So those are the things that we see in the transition from the K-12 setting, where there's a lot of accommodations, where teachers who really know you, who can advocate for you, who can sort of find the resources that are needed. In the post-secondary setting, there are a lot of other things that come into play, like a student who has trouble planning and organizing, even though they're very smart and they know the academic material, but they just can't organize themselves. There's just too many things that they have to keep track of. Sensory sensitivities, the lighting, the sounds, the things around in the environment, too many people, even these things can have a really discussing effect. And then independent living. Many of these folks are living at home with their parents for most of their lives, and they're very, very supported at home. Even meal preparation is daunting for these folks. And then communication difficulties, mental health struggles, anxiety, depression. So we were approached, Dr. Leah Birmingham and I were approached by the Center for Accessible Learning at SFU. And they said, look, these students are taking up the majority of our time. Is there something we can do to help, provide some kind of service so that these students can get the kinds of things that they need, not necessarily academic support or academic accommodations, but more social sorts of things. And so we put our heads together and we decided to develop a mentoring initiative, the Autism Mentoring Initiative, we call it ADDL, which in French means friend. And we matched autistic students with students who were more senior, either undergrad or graduate students. And we trained these mentor students on autism, and we gave them weekly supervision, not weekly, but monthly supervision. And what the goal is to enhance the social experience and the connection when they adjust to university. We also support academic success, although the mentor doesn't actually do any academic work with the student, but does help them find the right resources, go to the TA or those sorts of things. And also provide opportunities for personal growth and independence. And we integrated a research component to this to make sure that this program is effective and that we can better refine it over time. And so we did do a study to survey both the mentors and the mentees. They met regularly, maybe not weekly, depending on the student's schedule, but they worked on socializing, communication skills, managing anxiety, managing course loads, and even some career exploration. The autistic mentees show significantly greater social and emotional adjustment, also adjustment to university after having participated in this program for 2 semesters compared to when we first started the program. And then the mentees generally indicated that they were happy with their decision to join this program and that it helped them meet their personal and professional goals. And the mentors also reported some benefits. They believe that they had a more positive impact both personally and it also made an impact in terms of their professional goals. Do I have time? So now moving into the future, we haven't done this fully yet, but we're our next my lab's next initiative is to do more recruitment of autistic students into our lab, inclusion of autistic people in autism research. So why do we want this and why is it necessary? Because scientific depictions of autistic people have been downright dehumanizing, inaccurate, and uninformed. So just to give you sampling, here's one of the most renowned psychologists whose program of intervention, applied behavioral analysis, is still extensively used today. And he was quoted as saying, you see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense, they have hair and nose and mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing the person. You have the raw materials, but you have to do it first. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy now in the field about using ADA as an intervention method for young children with autism. But that just gives you sort of a feeling of the kinds of things that we said and thought about with autism. Here's Stephen Pinker, who I think most of you know, said, together with robots and chimpanzees, people with autism remind us that cultural learning is possible only because neurologically normal people have innate equipment to accomplish it. So again, very prominent, very impactful when somebody of that stature says something like that. So here's a reaction from an autistic person who's a scholar. She's from Dublin, and she said, I think the dehumanization of autistic people comes down to 2 things. First, people's perceptions of us are not based in reality, and second, people understand personhood too narrowly. If an autistic person can't do something people consider quintessentially human, like speaking, that doesn't mean that the autistic person isn't human. It means our assumptions of the abilities necessary to be a morally relevant person are wrong. So it tells us that we have been studying autistic people as scientists from our own perspective without really understanding it from their perspective, right? So it's a very biased perspective without including them in the process. So I think what I've read so far in terms of community engaged research, in terms of the neurodiversity movement, there are really mutual benefits. Like, we're not altruistic, let's face it, but researchers want to have a benefit when they do something, right? And so I would argue that there are mutual benefits to research involvement with the autistic partner or neurodivergent. It doesn't just have to be an autistic person. When we're studying atypical development, I think it really is, the onus is on us to involve people. And I see it from both perspectives. So for the autistic partner, there's the empowerment, like I have a voice, I'm involved in research that affects me. But for the researcher, there's really improved understanding. Like when you listen to folks and their own subjective experience, you get a whole new picture of what is going on. Like for the longest time, you know, you know, in the field we thought eye contact, well, you know, they're just not paying attention to faces, they're not looking at eyes. You know, there's something, or there was even a theory, and there still is a theory that eyes are so threatening that autistic people can't look at eyes. And then, you know, Alina did a study actually asking people, autistic people, well, people who had written online about their experience with eye contact. And I've seen so many people in the clinical context who've told me why they don't look at people in the eyes. And, you know, I would wager a guess that it has very little to do with that eyes can't be looked at because they're scary. It has more to do with other things, like when I look at the person's mouth, I can make more sense of the input that's coming in auditorily, right? So there are, and I'm not saying that's true for all autistic people, but it's another version of that that we need to listen to, right? So when we hear from them and their reasons, it will better help us to understand the full phenomenon. The other thing is the ownership of the research, right? So we're doing research about autistic people, and if they're involved, then they feel some ownership there. But also we have access to new opportunities. We know we can access that community better, we can recruit more individuals, a variety of different individuals. So there are benefits for us as researchers as well. And help in advocating for the needs. I really feel, as a clinician anyway, but also as a researcher, you know, when I do research and I know it's going to help a group of people, it makes it all that much more rewarding. And I also do really appreciate the greater impact of the work, right? So if you get more impact, it's more out there in the media as well. I've seen that over the years when we did the COVID study. We were asked multiple times, you know, for TV interviews, radio, you know, it had impact. And then it also engenders pride, I think, for autistic people to be involved in research that affects them. And for us, it improves our visibility, our credibility. So I think it's a win-win situation. So what we're doing in our lab is we've engaged autistic consultants through our partnership with Autistics United, and we're branching out to further to other groups. We're hoping to develop an advisory group of autistic consultants who we can have access to if we need, you know, we need to ask them about what they think about a particular proposal, or if they want to be involved at the very beginning stages of an idea or proposal. And we welcome community members to our lab meetings. Like, they're not closed meetings, anybody can come. And we've had parents, we've had autistic adults, we've had people who work in nonprofit organizations. A variety of people have come and shared their ideas for research. And all team members have an equal voice. It doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate student, an autistic student, everybody's equal and can speak out in terms of ideas that they have. So we've responded to some community research needs already. We've done a language preference study. You know, whether do people prefer being referred to as autistic or a person with autism. So we're, and this was something they wanted to know. Also, they came to us about experiences of the adult diagnostic process, and that's a study that's ongoing. And we also responded to the nonprofit organization's request to do a study during COVID to see what families, what was going on for families, so we could advocate to the government. So all in all, I think we're moving in that direction where we want to include and do research in a collaborative partnership way, rather than in this sort of isolated, you know, very narrowly a defined group. And that's these are all.
That was amazing timing, precision. Okay, we have time for questions. And we're gonna alternate between audience and Zoom. Okay. Okay, you got it. Okay, great.
That's great, that was excellent. Really appreciate the spec. Correct. What you're covering and keeping them short and really don't know me out as well as using research. That model, of course, is applicable to any other types of condition. And I'm just kind of wondering if there are pieces that are I think make sense practically, like intuitively makes sense. This question of how to make sure that they actually have impact. That's I want to say measurable. That's tangible. So you can actually stuff by doing this with administration X. No, that's not necessarily there in what you're doing, but there's the approach to use other conditions as well. So maybe you can speak a bit about how this focus on interaction between, for example, caregivers and the person, supporting the person more directly by social structures, and ultimately getting engaged in research has worked in other situations.
You mean it with other conditions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think autism is kind of the holy grail of, you know, if you can work with an autistic person and improve their lives and their families' lives, I think you can work with other developmental disabilities, because honestly, they are, like I said, I showed you the references on depression for these families, for these parents. It is much higher than any other condition, even, you know, Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. So these families have a huge burden in some sense, because autism is so, well, it's so diverse, but it also affects so many different aspects of their development, right? So there are medical issues, there are mental health issues, there are cognitive issues, you know, there's a whole variety of things. And so I think if we have a model that works for autism, it can be tweaked for other conditions like ADHD, for even Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So there are many different, the model can be tweaked for these other conditions. So when we're talking about this compassionate and drinking approach, I'm sure that if we get it to the point where it's really effective for autistic parents, for parents of autistic children or autistic parents as well, we can probably tweak it for other conditions, because there's lots of similarity in terms of their experience. Is that an answer to the first question?
Thanks, there. The questions from Zoom, but maybe if I may also add, read out some of the comments from the Zoom chat that have been here. Just because no one here in person can see that, and I want to make sure that we get the. So Susan Fitzpatrick, and I think this came during the social stigma high school work side, and this is such important work. Too often they research in clinical communities more is very limited aspects of the dynamics of interactions between individuals with diagnosed disabilities and caregivers of others, and how these interactions can have both positive and negative influences. The second person on Zoom, Sarah J, has shared that as an undiagnosed autistic person, as a PhD student in ecology and as a fusion, has joined this talk specifically to see this. And it's been pleasantly surprised by how this research approach really centered the humanity of autistic people. So thank you. Thank you. And if I may now, there's a question from Bryce Phillips. In your experience, have small social abnormalities been pathologized? For example, if someone is a little bit socially awkward, do you find people thinking maybe on their own spectrum?
Yes, so as autism research and becomes more available and there are screening measures online and there are there's lots of information now in the media and so on. So people may question whether they're autistic because they are socially a little awkward and such. So, but we have a very solid diagnostic process that can tell the difference between somebody who's socially shy or a little awkward versus somebody who's autistic. The measures, I'm very confident, are really good. And somebody who's got good experience in the field would be able to differentiate that.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. Do you want? I'll bring it over. I'm on this. Thank you. You want to hold the full race?
Hi, thank you for the talk. Robert from SFU. I thought it was really interesting, the statistic you noted about your study being 98% of the caregivers were mothers. And I wanted to know if you could speak a bit more about that, why you think it is, and what you think maybe the effects of are on the family dynamic in that.
Yes, that's a really good question. It's quite a robust, sort of finding in many studies in the autism field, but I would say probably more generally in the developmental disabilities field, that mothers tend to take the majority of the caretaking. In fact, many mothers give up their career when they have a child who's been diagnosed with autism. So it even affects the family's finances. And not to mention, when you give up a career, there could be quite a bit of resentment and even depression that comes along with that. We don't quite know exactly why it is that mothers tend to be the primary caretakers. But there are some hypotheses, that fathers feel more responsibility to bring on the financial side, and they feel more effective in those roles. So doing things for the family that are less about caretaking, but more about the family's finances or structuring, activities or driving kids around. But moms tend to be those who, even in my clinical experience, who are the ones who do the majority of, school meetings, individual education plan, taking care of the kids at home, homeschooling them. Many of these kids are homeschooled. So yes, mothers are definitely at risk because they are often at home with their children and quite isolated, in fact, because, like I said, many of them don't work, or if they work, they only work part-time. So that, yeah, there's a need for research around that. But I can't give you a straight answer as to why that is. Unfortunately.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is a question from Stephen Fitzpatrick on Zoom. Could you please expand a bit on the interlevel interactions? For example, how variations in sensory processing could result in how one pays attention or how one interacts with others, resulting in a cascade of feedback loops?
Yeah, so how sensory issues might affect a person's attention, is that really a question? Yeah. So a lot of autistic people have sensory either hyper or hyposensitivity. And we suspect that there's some dysregulation in how they manage sensory input. Now some of that is interestingly linked to some positive things, like being very sensitive to even visual stimuli might be related to and also picking up on details, might be related to artistic talents or some a subset of autistic people have perfect pitch. They're incredible musicians, and so maybe some of these sensory sensitivities actually are linked somehow to some of the talents we see in these folks. But in other contexts, they can really be distressing. So, for example, in a huge lecture classroom, autistic students often say that they can't pay attention because they're too distracted by, sounds in the background noise, the lighting, and just like seeing like the number of people or people moving, various distractions that really take away from their ability to focus on what is most relevant, the lecture, right? And so it can really impact their, not because they're not able to do the work, but because of these sensitivities that affect their ability to concentrate.
Okay, do we have time for a few more questions? If we've got. Okay, go first.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in. Thank you, Brett, for this amazing talk and incredible work. This is great. First off, UBC. I wanted to pull up a little bit of the model questions, including to the top question from Zoom, in terms of how we can best understand and change our understanding about this whole notion of a spectrum that many people work with right now, which are the different features that you described, like motor changes, social changes, cognitive changes, perceptual changes. Do we know, or what's your idea of how different features relate to the idea of spectrum, which seems one-dimensional to me? And do you feel that some multi-dimensional approach would be better? And if so, how do you see, are any of these features primary? That relates to Susan's question, because many of these occur as a primary change and then lead to a secondary changes in functioning. And how do they distribute across people? And finally, if you have any information, how do people with autism specifically view this notion of the spectrum? Do they feel like it matches their experience? Do they feel like it's too limiting?
Good question. Wow. Okay. I would say that the spectrum doesn't quite really capture. So like you said, it's not kind of this dimensional, this steady increase, or less of this, more of this, or of all the symptoms. What I think it looks more like is different pathways to the same outcome, right? So you have some folks coming to be autistic with a whole different set of features compared to the next person who has a whole different set, but they end up having the same behavioral outcome that meets the criteria. So it's very similar, I would say. I think we have to do more research comparing, the ways that people are diagnosed with intellectual disability, right? We know that you can have exposure to alcohol during pregnancy, and you can have FASD and intellectual disability. You can be exposed to like oxygen deprivation during birth, and you can have intellectual disability. You can have a genetic chromosomal difference, or genetic deletion, and you can end up having intellectual disability. I think autism is very similar. I think there are different sets or underlying etiologies and different profiles that can lead to autism, but that they're quite different, and you might need very different types of interventions. Is that making sense?
Yeah. Sounds like a lot more work.
Well, subtyping, we really have, and this has been taught when I was here on Monday, that was kind of the theme. Subtyping is the way to go. We can't understand these folks under one big umbrella. We have to start subtyping and understanding subgroups.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Zoom, okay.
Thank you. This question is from Sarah on Zoom. And it's a follow-up question to what you said about the diagnostic process being very good. Do you have thoughts on the potential underdiagnosis of autistic women?
Oh, yes. Well, I can tell you this, that years ago, and I started when I came to BC was in 2000, and it was the Wild West of diagnosis. So basically, nobody knew anything about how to do a standardized diagnostic assessment. And then the government implemented the funding, and then everybody was doing standardized diagnostic assessments. But still, I was seeing mostly males, boys, or then older, teens and young adults. But over the years, in the last, probably I would say 3 years, I would say I've seen as many girls and women as I am males. So it has really exploded. And I think that is due to research. There has been an explosion of research on the female phenotype. And so now we understand much more about what autism looks like in females. And it's changing. So there are a lot more women and girls being diagnosed. Okay, maybe one last.
Yeah, if you think we have time. 10:01, let's see how we can take one.
Hi, thanks. My name is Michael, associated with SFU. Simon Fraser. I helped co-found a school in BC a bunch of years ago, and we developed a special needs program that grew to include many hundreds of special needs families, self-designed program.
Oh, yes.
And I'm well aware of the gulf that exists between, K-12 school and the gulf that exists between K-12 and then, into post-secondary opportunities. And we referenced the mentoring program at SFU and the pioneered the mindfulness program for parents. And I commend you for those, but I wonder, currently, are most post-secondary institutions still on their own at developing initiatives just to offer more supports for special needs learners entering undergrad tracks and graduate studies tracks, because that is an enormous gulf and leads to, it is a very formidable barrier for so many students contemplating a path, and they need to know and support, but it's such a minefield of interacting government departments supporting, but I wonder, again, my references, the question is about other universal supports offered, or are post-secondary institutions on their own to develop their own supports?
Yeah, they are on their own. And I'll tell you, we modeled our we modeled our program after York. So York was one of the first ones to develop an autism mentoring program. But since there have been many more, but it is up to the university. There is no universal support for these folks or any other neurodivergent group. And really, it is so necessary to have something, because the potential that is there, these students are, I remember one of my first volunteers in my lab was an autistic young man who came into the university with a scholarship. And within the first year, he dropped out. And it wasn't because he wasn't brilliant, right? He had a scholarship. It was because it was just overwhelming, right? And so that's what you get. You get very brilliant students who cannot code. with navigating the system. And that's a huge loss, right? So we need these mentoring programs, but even at SFU, I mean, it's tenuous, right? Like these things are funded and there's budgets, so every year, it's like, is it gonna still be funded or, you know, and it doesn't take a lot of money, but still, it has to be prioritized somewhere in the budget.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Grace. That was wonderful.